Politicians promise tariffs will force foreign countries to pay for market access. Economists warn those same tariffs trigger domestic inflation and stall manufacturing. To understand who is right, we have to isolate exactly when the protection a tariff offers actually outweighs the economic damage it guarantees. We start at the physical bottleneck of international trade. Millions of containers arrive at domestic ports every day. When those goods arrive, the foreign government does not write a check to the United States. A tariff is not a bill sent abroad. Instead, a tariff is a tax paid directly to the U.S. government by the domestic importing company when those goods cross the border. This flowchart maps the financial journey. An item is shipped to a U.S. port at a base cost. Here, the tariff is applied. The U.S. business pays that fee to customs, raising the total cost. The importer passes this higher cost down the chain. At the retail shelf, the final price is marked up to cover that border tax. Mechanically, a broad-based tariff functions as a regressive domestic tax. It drives up inflation directly at the checkout line for budget-conscious consumers. Evaluating trade policy requires looking past the political pitch. Tariffs represent a high-stakes trade-off. You can provide targeted protection for a specific industry, but you will create an aggregate economic drag for everyone else. This comparison matrix shows how economists evaluate the damage. We divide policy into two approaches: highly targeted tariffs and broad-based tariffs. In the short term, sweeping broad-based tariffs do achieve one goal. They create a massive spike in federal revenue collected at the border. But the immediate trade-off is severe. Broad tariffs disproportionately punish low and middle-income households by rapidly inflating the retail price of everyday goods. But the long-term economic danger escalates significantly when these sweeping tariffs are applied to intermediate inputs rather than just finished consumer goods. Intermediate inputs are the raw materials required to build other things. Domestic heavy industries, like steel and aluminum producers, heavily lobby for protection. Shielding these raw material producers works for them. It stops foreign competitors from dumping cheap metal into the market, which boosts the specific profits of domestic mills. The penalty hits downstream. Artificially inflating the cost of steel and aluminum raises the baseline production costs for domestic automakers, appliance builders, and machinery manufacturers who rely on those parts. Because their parts cost more, their finished products cost more. American-made goods suddenly become significantly more expensive and far less competitive in the global market. You secure a short-term win for the raw material supplier, but you trigger a long-term loss for the broader manufacturing sector. Placing tariffs on intermediate inputs essentially taxes domestic manufacturers for choosing to build things in America. It directly undermines the goal of industrial growth. There are scenarios where economists consider tariffs justifiable. These are cases where a nation needs to protect highly specific, strategic infant industries or sectors vital to national security. Advanced technology manufacturing is the prime example. Building state-of-the-art microchips requires massive capital, and these facilities need a temporary shield from heavily subsidized foreign competition. The logic holds up here. Shielding these specific sectors buys them the time required to build domestic capacity and achieve economies of scale without being crushed by cheaper imports on day one. However, this global map illustrates the inevitable consequence of any strategic tariff: foreign retaliation. Foreign nations rarely retaliate against the protected industry itself. Instead, they aim at unrelated, politically sensitive U.S. export sectors to inflict maximum economic pain. A trade war over advanced microchips or green technology routinely ends with devastating retaliatory tariffs placed on American farmers. This collateral damage forces the government to react again, often pouring heavy subsidies into the retaliated against sectors just to keep them out of bankruptcy. In a highly interconnected global economy, protecting a domestic strategic sector almost always requires sacrificing a domestic export sector. Systems thinkers and economists attempt to optimize trade policy to minimize this exact kind of drag. This checklist outlines the core framework required to make a tariff function successfully as a strategic tool, rather than a political blunt instrument. First, the policy must be highly targeted and explicitly exempt raw materials. This exemption is the only way to protect domestic manufacturers from absorbing devastating supply chain cost increases. Second, the policy must include strict sunset clauses. Hard expiration dates force domestic industries to innovate and compete. Without them, industries grow lazy and permanently dependent on a government shield. Third, and most difficult, active revenue recycling. The government must actively recycle the new border tax revenue into domestic R&D grants or income tax cuts. This is necessary to offset the regressive price hikes that consumers will experience at the store. Executing this requires immense fiscal discipline. Governments typically absorb new tariff revenue into general spending, leaving consumers to absorb the pain alone. Ultimately, trade barriers are a high-risk economic tool, not a cure-all. Tariffs must be treated as a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. Used broadly, they guarantee inflation and drag down GDP. Used with precision and strict limits, they can successfully buy time for the industries of the future.